book I chose to read for my book talk is called From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler. It's written by E. L. Konigsberg, and a little bit about the author is she was born in New York City, and she grew up in Pennsylvania. For about a year and a half, her family moved to Youngstown, Ohio, but for the rest of her life she lived in Pennsylvania. She attended Carnegie Mellon University for her undergrad, studying chemistry, and she continued on to graduate studies at the University of Pittsburgh, also studying chemistry. Right after she graduated from grad school, she went to Florida, got married, and had 3 kids. She moved back to New York then, and after her 3rd child went to school, she decided to start writing. And that is where she wrote her very first book, which is the one I read, that received the Newbery Medal. Now, I'm going to talk about the book, and since it's told through the perspective of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler, I'm going to get into my role of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler for the story. So, it starts off with the whole book is based off of her writing a letter to her lawyer explaining that she wants to change her will. And it starts off with her telling the story of where it all began. And I'm not going to tell the ending, but I'll tell up until then. So first, it talks about a girl named Claudia, who's the oldest of 4. And she has a younger brother named Jamie, who, for his age, is rich. And obviously he didn't make a lot of money during this time period. But Claudia is just tired of her family. She feels like she doesn't get any attention. And she just wants to run away, like every child goes through. So she decides she wants to run away to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And she knows that in order to do this, she needs money. And she doesn't have a lot of money because she loses it to chores. So what she does is one day on the school bus, she talks to her brother and proposes the idea to him. And of course, being a young boy, he loves the idea and wants to go. Then Claudia tells him that she needs his money too. And at first, he was a little frugal about it, but he was all about it. So they planned on a Wednesday to leave. They stayed on the bus, and then they got off at the lot and took a bus, into New York City. And first thing I have to show is playing cards. And I have these playing cards because they represent how Jamie made all of his money. He played a game called War, which is a card game, with his best friend on the bus every day since the 2nd grade. And they kept playing, and he kept betting him from anywhere from pennies to nickels. And he would always win. So that's how Jamie made all of his money, and he always saved up because he was very good about it. So that's where they got their money. So they go to the museum, and they have to figure out a plan to make it work. So Claudia and Jamie get there. They go in, and they hid all their clothes in a trumpet case and a violin case. So they have all their clothes ready, they hid them in the museum, and then at closing time, they hid in the bathroom stalls until all the staff members were gone. And then they came out, they found a bed, and they decided to start exploring the museum. They went to the Italian Renaissance corner, they went to the Egyptian corner, they discovered everything in the museum there was to see. They loved it, and day after day they had a routine. And another way, what they did every day was, I have this change to show how Jamie and Claudia survived, living in the museum for a week. Everything they paid for was with change. They'd buy food with change, they'd buy the paper with change, and when they started to run out, they started bathing in the fountain at the museum and getting more change to pay for things, because it was the only money they had. Then one day, Claudia and Jamie, there's a big deal going on in the museum, and they discover an angel. Not the exact angel, but it helps display. There's a statue of this angel that comes into the museum. It was bought at an auction for $225, which at the time was very, very inexpensive for a piece of art and a little unreasonable. And so this statue came into the museum, and they thought it was by a sculptor designed and made by Michelangelo. Well, they didn't know for sure, so they kept doing a lot of research on the statue. And they still didn't know whether or not it was made by Michelangelo. And it was a mystery that they needed to be solved. So Claudia and Jamie became obsessed with this angel. And every day they went to the library, they did research on the angel, they read books, everything they could get their hands on, they looked for. Well, one day they stumbled across this symbol. It was 3 circles with an M in it. And they later found out that this symbol was something that Michelangelo left on his statues. So, after they discovered this at the library, they decided to write a letter to the museum and tell them about it. So, I have this letter. And this is, Claudia wrote a letter to the museum stating that they found this symbol and that it was Michelangelo's symbol that he usually left on his statue or his sculptures after he made them. So they went and they bought a P.O. box and they waited. Within a few days they received a letter back saying that they already knew this information, but that they were very grateful for the information that they provided, and that if they knew anything else to let them know as soon as possible. So Claudia and Jamie were determined to find out about this angel. The only other thing they knew is that the statue was purchased from a woman named Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler. And so they decided to look her up as well. They found out that she moved from New York to Farmington, Connecticut. So they decided to get on a bus and go to Farmington, Connecticut. They showed up at Mrs. Frankweiler's house and just completely unannounced and came in. And Mrs. Frankweiler was willing to speak with them. So Mrs. Frankweiler then tells them that she asks them why they're there, and they tell her that they would like to know more about the angel. And she has a whole wall of filing cabinets in her house filled with paperwork. And she tells them that she will give them 1 hour to look through all the paperwork to see if they can find the file about the angel and who really sculpted it. So I have this folder to show how all the files they had to go through. They had to go through so many files but only had an hour to do it. So did they accomplish it or not? You'll have to find out to read the book.